welcome to our 5-step discussion on step 5. And today I'm really pleased to introduce Chris from Ireland, John and Richard from England, and Wendy from Holland. And I'd like to start with John. So John, can you tell me about what makes a good step 5 and what does that mean for the family member and the practitioner?
So yes, I really like to, in my practice, use the material that's provided when we are doing our training and when we've completed our training. And that is the 5-step handbook that I often have, well, not often, but all the time have a copy. And the client themselves will have a copy and we go through it together. Now, particularly at the end, at step 5, when we're reviewing steps 1 to 4, I will then ask the individual to turn to step 1, as I do, and just run through some of the highlights and then ask what they can remember, what has been useful, just 1 or 2 points. And then that can be put into an action later on. So I'm in great favor of using the paperwork as a prompt so that I don't have to try and remember what's next. The other thing I like to do is when we hear names mentioned by the client is to make a note, almost a physical note, and then at some point ask them if the grandparents would like a session with myself, or the brother-in-law, these other people that surround the family member. And I think that makes a big difference to my practice in any way. So.
Great, that's really helpful, John. So kind of key points for you are yet using the materials that are already there. So the handbook's coming really vital for you and the family member in reviewing the steps. And then also that you can offer sessions to other members of the family, and that can be very helpful.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. That's great. Thank you for those tips. So I'd now like to move on to Chris from Ireland.
Thanks, Jill. I suppose similar to John, it relates to some of the paperwork, and I think that when I think a good practice for step 5, a significant part of the work is the family member questionnaire and our use of it and how we use it. It's already been filled out in step 1. It's been brought into each one of the steps so far. So it actually plays a vital role in being able to validate change for the family member. So we're reviewing the steps in step 5, and there's some exploration or conversation about, what changes have taken place. And yet I think we can underestimate like how much value there is in the family member questionnaire. When I think of good practice, when I hear practitioners that have prepared and planned for it, they're already familiar with the scoring of the first family member questionnaire, and they're able to feedback some of the changes as the family member questionnaire is being filled out. This I think is great practice. This is really, really helpful to the family member themselves, because they've already talked about changes, but they're still not entirely certain, and that, even though it's changed that they might have talked about already, when they see a score even move from often to sometimes, or often to once or twice, it actually validates the change even more. Or sometimes it points out changes that they weren't aware of. So our skill then, when I think of good practice, the skill is being able to pause at the relevant points that is really supportive for the family member going through it. And I think in practice, it's about the practitioner being able to, it's about preparation and planning and the use of the family member questionnaire and the timing of it. There's quite a lot to do in step 5, so the timing of it as well is a really good sign of good practice. Very, very important part of it, I think.
Thanks, Chris. So it's really good to hear about the importance of the questionnaire and it validating the family member changes, and also it being of great use to the practitioner and preparing for that and looking back at those changes. So thanks for that, Chris. So now on to Wendy from Holland.
Yes, What I think is good practice in step 5 is to not only review, but also focus on what's coming next, and making a good action plan, which can really help the family member to go on and keep the good changes going, and arrange things that still need to be arranged to keep on going. And I also think it's very important to make an appointment with a family member after 6 weeks or 3 months, or both. That would be the best case scenario for me, to review and help them with last questions or other things they still struggling with, and do the family member questionnaire again, so you can show them that they are still on track and still going strong and still doing what they wished to do. This is come back as very helpful for family members themselves, but also for us as practitioners. It can be helpful to see that changes go on when you really talk them through, and help them make a good plan. They can go on without you and have a good time after the sessions as well.
Great, that's really helpful, Wendy. So that is reinforcing about making the action plan with the family member, and again validating this use of the family member questionnaire. And in fact, that it is a brief intervention, so it's important that family members feel empowered to go away and continue to reflect and make changes for themselves. So thanks, Wendy. So finally, on to Richard from England.
Hello. Well, I think all the things that the other practitioners have said, I would completely agree with. And I particularly like what Wendy just said about how important it is that family members realise that these changes can continue beyond the 5-step method. And it's very powerful for us as practitioners when we re-see somebody after 6 weeks or 3 months, and to see that they have continued changing. And that's very empowering for them, and also very empowering for us as practitioners. But I think, thinking about step 5 in particular, the main thing for me is spending enough time on each element of step 5. And that means not rushing through the review of each of the previous steps, and not assuming that we know what any further needs are, or assuming that we know what the needs of other people in the family are, or of the relative with a problem. I remember one time going through each step with a family member I was working with. It was amazing how much she told me that she had gained. Going over it in detail was extremely useful for me as a practitioner, because obviously it's nice for us to feel that we're being helpful and being effective. But it was amazing to see the changes in her, and going over it in detail helped for her to really reinforce those changes that have been made. And the other thing, which is something that Chris has already mentioned, is how powerful it is to go through the changes in the FMQ answers. So this idea that we redo the FMQ and then compare what they said right at the beginning with what they're saying now. Somehow, for many affected family members, actually seeing how their scores and their answers have changed makes those changes somehow even larger. And again, with another family member I was working with, I remember that she said that she realized even more than she had before, how much less stressed she was and what she was doing to cope in a much more calm way, because she could see how her answers had changed.
Right, thank you, Richard. Well, thank you to all of you for those tips and those good practice. And I think the key points there, and there were many of them, I mean, the things were about preparing for the step, because this is all about reviewing what's happened in the previous 4 steps. So preparation is crucial. Spending enough time reviewing each of those steps, the use of the handbook, opening up the possibility of seeing other family members. The family member questionnaire has come out as crucial to help review those steps. And we've also emphasised in the preceding clip about the timing of when you do the family member questionnaire. And making an action plan is vital. And all of those, the most important thing is the family member feels empowered. And I think every one of us can think about how empowering it is to hear the changes that they've made. The situation may not have changed for them about their relative with the problem, but they themselves feel more empowered, less stressed and more supported. So that's a very powerful thing. Now we're going to just move on to what some of the common problems are in delivering step 5, and we're going to go through them related to each of the criteria in step 5. So we're starting with Chris, and we're just going to look at the beginning of the session and moving on to reviewing step 1 to 4. So over to Chris.
Okay, all right, thanks, Jill. So what I'll cover first is the first criteria, which is about the introduction of the step itself. This is the beginning of the session, and this is, you know, having a warm welcome and setting out a clear and structured agenda for the session. And it's about giving the purpose of step 5. And I think something that we come across quite often is maybe we don't give a very clear and structured agenda for the session. This is actually quite important because as we can see, like, there's quite a lot to do here in this session. And if it's a thing that we don't lay it out clearly for the family member in the beginning, sometimes that it's harder then to pull time back in the session itself when we need it. It's actually really important. And it's great for the family member at the beginning to know, okay, this is what we're going to be doing in each section. And it's much easier for us then to be able to create that flow from one criteria to the next later on. Sometimes as well, we don't actually explain the purpose of step 5, which is actually quite important then as well. Again, for the family member to know, okay, this is the piece of work we're going, this is what it's about, and this is what I expect to kind of walk away with. So very important. I mean, this is setting out the structure and the kind of container for the work that's going to take place for the next 50 minutes. And I suppose another part then as well is that, you know, we're always checking to see if the previous session was helpful. And I suppose if it's an open-ended question, like, it can be difficult for the family member to remember. And that while, you know, I think we can assume sometimes that you remember every single part of it, but they've been with us for 50 minutes, maybe a week ago. And in the meantime, they've stepped back into their stressful environment for a week. Mm-hmm. And that it's really helpful for them when we remind them what the last step was about, just reminding them of what the purpose was, and even giving just a brief overview of what took place. And this is really helpful for a family member to say, oh yeah, no, I like that because this was helpful, or that wasn't. And I suppose for step 5 in particular, you don't need to spend a lot of time on this because you're going to be reviewing the steps anyway. But just important to know that we need to cover each one of them points. Very helpful for the session itself and for the family member. I suppose anytime I'd introduce a criteria, I'd introduce it as my favorite or the most important. So I'd say this one is also the most important, the reviewing of the steps themselves. I would say that one of the problems we come across is that this might not be structured very well, or that we give a very kind of vague, kind of open-ended question asking the family member as to, you know, what has the work been like up to date? What has the 5-step method been of value to you? And it can be hard. It's similar to the recap in the session. Like, it can be difficult for a family member to remember all the works that's kind of taken place. So it's really important for us to be able to structure the reviewing of the steps, and we need to do it one step at a time. So we spend 5 minutes reviewing step 1. We remind them what the aim of the step was. We remind them that it was about telling their story and about identifying stress and maybe what impact that had on not just the family member, but their family, and maybe a little recap of some of the work to take place and what that was like for them.
So Chris, it's really, so the important points coming out of that is structuring the session, really vital, that you prepare for the session as a practitioner. So looking back and then making sure it's not just how was it for you, but it's really going into, let's have a look at step 1. It was about this. Tell me what's happened. And then logically going through each one, spending enough time.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for that. So I'd like to just move on to ask John what his thoughts are.
Yes, I know. Excuse me. I know in my practice and listening to some recordings, sometimes it's to allow time for the FM to talk about themselves. And very often a family member, sorry, FM, that was an abbreviation, a family member can shift into talking about their loved one and their use and that problem. And I encourage the family member to just pause for a minute and for them to talk about themselves rather than their loved one's use or problems just at the moment. And so that has to be guided carefully. You don't want to ignore that issue, but this is a moment for them and what help they need rather than their loved one who is using or otherwise. And then the other issue sometimes is that we practitioners can sometimes slip into that this is an action for both parties. And by that, I mean, sometimes we can easily get involved in the writing reflex, trying to think of things for the FM to do. But it really is to mine in what the FM has lost over the months or years of their loved one's use. And if they would like to re-engage with that, again, mine questions like, what would you need to do that? How would you do it? When would be the best time to do that? So they're thinking of things for themselves to do. And again, this is where some points in the FMQ can become very useful. And I know I highlight questions like 1 and 2 or 22 and 24 that brings out the need or the desires for the family member themselves. So yeah, 5.3 for me is about concentrating on the family member and not at this point on their loved one.
Thank you, John. That was all very well said. Thank you. So moving on to Wendy.
Thank you, Jill. Yeah, I agree with John that focusing on the family member is a very important part of step 5. But after that, we focus on other ones, beginning with the using relative. And the common problems I see and experienced myself is that you could be focusing on the family member a bit too much and forgetting to go into depth on this one. And especially when time is an issue, this is a bit in the end, you see that people rush going through this part, while this is also an important piece because you want the action plan to be formed in a manner which will help the family member and everything around them to get further in their process. So you shouldn't only ask, does anyone else need help? And when they say no, move on. But you should really go into depth, finding things that could help people. And it could be going to special organizations, but it could also be a course in mindfulness or the desire to have a walk every day together and talk about something else than the using relative making mistakes in life. Or, you should try to make it as big and as wide as possible to have a good result. And I think one of the most common mistakes is that we do ask, but we only ask because we have to, and we don't really go into depth. And that's really a shame, because it can really, really add to the well-being of the family member as well, if you go through the whole process of the using relative, as well as other people around them. So not only when it's a mom, I had a mom once, you can go and talk about her and her son, but you can also include a daughter, which was kind of forgotten a bit, and a husband, but maybe also neighbors or best friends, or you can make it as big as possible, so you can make a complete picture of everyone in their environment.
Thank you, Wendy. I think that's important, isn't it, to include everybody, that we've got this importance about focusing on the family member, but it's also important to focus on others. And obviously, lots of family members are there about the using relative. So it's important to ask them about the person and whether indeed the using relative does want some help, because it may be they don't want any help. They're not at that stage, but it's important to ask and be armed with some answers and think about the wider family. So thank you, Wendy. So finally on to Richard.
Right, well, I just want to concentrate on the last two criteria that we have in step 5. And the fifth criterion is that after the review has been completed, we redo the FMQ and compare the FMQ, as we've been talking about already. And excuse me, there are two big problems that I want to focus on to do with this criterion. The first one is actually counsellors not redoing the FMQ at all. So in listening to tapes when I'm assessing people for accreditation, it's amazing that sometimes people actually miss this one out entirely. They forget to do it, or they do it but they rush through it, or they rush through it but then they don't compare the answers with the first one, and so they don't highlight any changes. So I think the problem can be dealt with really quite easily by the practitioner preparing beforehand and having ready a form of words that they can use to seamlessly introduce a topic. Something like, you'll remember that we completed a questionnaire at the start in our first session, and we've looked at it a number of times throughout the sessions. Well, I want us to complete it again so we can see if any of your answers have changed, and if so, how and why you think these things have changed. So if you have that form of words ready and you've said it yourself a few times and you've prepared it, then it's quite easy to say that at the right time, and it just happens quite seamlessly. The other criterion I want to focus on is the last one, ending the session. And as with Chris, when he talked about the beginning of the session, there are lots of little tasks associated with that criterion. And the biggest problem is practitioners not being in charge of that process. So actually not leaving enough time to think about all the things that you need to do at the end of the last session, which is summarizing the main issues, checking obviously if the session was helpful, reminding people about the fact that they've got the self-help handbook that they should use, agreeing on any post 5-step method work, as Wendy was talking about, thinking about an action plan, if your organization allows it, arranging a 6-week or a 3-monthly follow-up, even if it's just a follow-up telephone call. We know there's a lot of research evidence now that if clients know that they're going to be contacted in 3 months' time, that has a very significant effect on continuing improvements that people have. Again, really the problems, which are lack of structure and not introducing things properly, they can be dealt with again by the practitioner preparing beforehand, and again having ready a form of words that they can use. Things like, we've discussed what further work you may need to do, now we're finishing. Don't forget the handbook, which has got lots of useful material in it. And there are lots of ways that we can say these things, and if we're prepared and how we're going to say them, it's all just a lot easier.
Thank you, Richard. So I think what everybody's saying here, and it's the same for every step that we've done, is preparation is key. 5-step can seem very simple, and there are lots of things that are very, very easy about it, but there are lots of things to remember. So it's important preparation. Lots of people have checklists in front of them. It is absolutely fine to have that checklist with you and to say to the family member, I just want to check that I've done everything, and look down at it, because there are many things to remember, and particularly if you're new to doing the intervention, it's hard to remember all of it. So we hope this session is giving you some areas of good practice and also highlighted some of the issues and how to overcome them. So thank you very much to everybody for that. So I'd just like to review some of the key points from the panel discussion. And the overarching one was about the preparation for this step. So really do ensure that you have prepared really well. So you need to review your notes from all the previous sessions and to look at the results of the initial family member questionnaire. And Chris and John both emphasise this a lot, along with using the handbooks when reviewing. So it reminds the family member of what's happened in each step. And John said, don't be worried about using your checklist, your notes. It will all help to make a really good session. Spend enough time on each step. Richard really emphasised this. It's really powerful, this step, for the family member, for them to see what changes have been made in their lives. Wendy emphasised having a really good action plan and arranging a follow-up session. And it was also important not only to focus on the family member, but what other family members might need and the person with the problem. So do allow enough time, as going in depth about this will help everyone. And finally, the very major point is going through the changes in the family member questionnaire. You're going to be doing the family member questionnaire at the end of step 5. It can be incredibly powerful for the family member. It shows them what changes have been made in their life. And so it's really, really empowering. And also for the practitioner, it reinforces the journey that's happened throughout this brief intervention and emphasises the action plan and what's changed for the family member. So I hope you found those points useful from the panel discussion. There's lots of hints and tips there. So thank you very much, and a thank you to everybody.